We begin with the study of the question, what is ethics? These are questions which philosophy likes to ask. So philosophy is, we could say, self-reflective because philosophy asks questions about itself. And the question, well, what is ethics, is a question about the nature of the study of that discipline, which is called ethics. So ethics is a branch of philosophy. You can relate it to, for example, mathematics, which has geometry and algebra and calculus. Well, philosophy, for example, has ethics. It has metaphysics, which studies being, reality. It has epistemology, which studies knowledge. It has aesthetics, which studies the nature of the beautiful and art. So ethics is distinguished from these for the reason that it studies morality, and in particular, moral actions. So we all know what moral actions are. They're actions that we call good and bad, and just and unjust, and right and wrong, etc. So ethics studies these things as well as the moral person, the persons who do these things, so the morally virtuous, the morally good person or bad person. It also studies the motivations underlying these actors, and also tied to this are ethical claims about language. So if I say, you shouldn't lie, well, you can ask the question, what kind of a claim is that? It's an imperative, right? It's a command. You shouldn't lie. So is there a truth value that attaches to that? Can you say that the statement, you shouldn't lie, is true? So these are the types of questions that ethics asks about. Classically speaking, and by classically speaking, and I might use that throughout other videos, I mean, well, within the ancient times and the medieval times, up to from about 500 BC to about, let's say, the 15th century. So it's a large span of time. But anyhow, classically speaking, the sciences, or the branches of knowledge, were divided into two kinds. They had what were called theoretical sciences and practical sciences. So theoretical sciences were those sciences that sought knowledge for the sake of itself. For example, a pure mathematician. I'm just studying the nature of the three-body problem, three bodies, and how to describe them. You can ask, why are you doing this? The mathematician says, I have no absolute reason for doing this. I just want to know. So that's a theoretical science. And here's some examples you see here of theoretical sciences. Math, physics, metaphysics, the study of reality. It's a philosophical discipline. Other sciences were called practical sciences. Today we might call them applied sciences, for example. They're sciences in which you're learning things, and you're not just learning to know. You're learning things so that you can achieve things. So you're learning knowledge, and the knowledge serves as a means to some other end. So a doctor, for example, studies health. And they study health not just to know what health is, but to heal. So for example, if a doctor knew how to save someone who was having a heart attack and didn't apply that knowledge and said, no, I just like the knowledge, you'd say, well, there's something wrong with that person, right? So now, given that last example with the doctor, where do you suppose that ethics best fits within this? And so if you guessed practical science, you guessed it right. So ethics is a type of practical science. Within ethics, we seek knowledge of morality, and the idea is not just to know what it is, but to become good as well. And here it is. We seek knowledge of the good and the bad, right and wrong, not so much for the sake of knowing such things, but rather for being good and censoring the bad. In other words, doing the right thing, formulating just laws, criminal justice, etc. So, although this idea still remains in sort of contemporary modern times, it's kind of been diminished, partly because ethics has become an academic discipline, and academics like to study things, just for the sake of the knowledge of it. So the kind of idea of doing ethics to become good has kind of changed. Also because within ancient times and medieval times, there was a kind of very straightforward normative way of doing the right things. They had specific laws, and everybody had to obey those laws and specific moral codes, and everyone had to do that. Today, well, we seem to have various moral laws and moral codes in different cultures and democratic times, so we really can't say that we're doing ethics to become good, because you can say, well, become good in what way? And who's good? What type of virtuous types of things are we talking about? Well, what is the right way of becoming good? So these are all questions that we now ask. So there are different, let's say, branches or subdivisions of ethics, and I'm listing 4 here. You could divide it into other different branches, but the branches generally can be divided up into this. So the first is normative ethics. This studies ethical theories. Now, an ethical theory is basically a theory about what right and wrong action, good and bad action, and actors are. You see that? So you could think of a theory of number, right? Someone gives a theory of number of what number is and the nature and properties of numbers and their relations. Well, normative theories are like that. It talks about what types of theories there are about the nature of the good and the bad. The next one is applied ethics, which studies, well, how do we apply these theoretical issues to practical problems? This kind of is the area of where the ancient notion of ethics as a practical science kind of still lives to this day. So what we do in this area is we ask a question such as, well, is abortion right? And then we apply our ethical theories and try to figure out whether it's right or wrong. And you can imagine, as there's different ethical theories, which we'll talk about in a minute, there's going to be different answers about, well, the question of abortion, euthanasia, animal rights, environmental destruction, and so on. One thing that you should understand, though, is that in discussing these questions, these applied ethical questions, generally, everyone has a kind of normative view. And this is kind of obvious because we all kind of have moral views and ideas, some of which we're not really aware of. So studying ethics kind of allows us to become aware of those views that we have when answering these types of questions. Okay. The next 2 are descriptive and meta-ethics. Notice here, we're going to be focusing on the first 2 in class. If you take one of the advanced courses in philosophy, you can get into this sort of tasty stuff. Descriptive ethics studies human beliefs about morality. So this kind of enters more into the social sciences area because it's kind of looking at, well, what do people think about these particular views of right and wrong? Kind of studies it, gets the statistics, kind of analyzes those statistics, etc. Meta-ethics, this is where the language of morality is studied. For example, if I say you shouldn't lie again, you see, well, the meta-ethicist will say, well, what is that type of statement? And what is it referring to? What's the truth value of that statement? Okay. Again, in this class, we're going to focus on these 2 particular areas. And in particular, on the first one, we're going to do most of our readings will be focused on that, and our problems will be in the second. Right? So let's look at some moral theories that we will be kind of studying in this class. And the first one, these moral theories have developed throughout history. They are relevant today, even as they've developed throughout history. Some are more popular than others. The popularity of some has kind of risen and fallen over history, etc. So the first one is virtue ethics. And this will be the view that we see mostly in Plato and Aristotle, the first 2 thinkers, that moral theorists that we will study in this class. So it's the theory that moral action is based upon a morally virtuous or vicious agent. So you could say, for example, well, John, he's a really courageous person. Now, notice that courage is a type of virtue. Or you could say, well, Linda, Linda can get really angry for no reason at all. She's nice, but she gets really angry. Okay, you could say, well, that's also a kind of a virtue. Well, in the opposite sense, a kind of vice, really angry, someone who's really greedy. Okay, so that's virtue ethics. Says, well, the morality of actions are based upon those agents who are morally virtuous or vicious. Deontology is another type of ethical moral theory, and it's the theory that right and wrong, good and bad, are based upon basic duties or rules or commands. For example, we have what's called divine command theory, which is a form of deontology, and basically we have the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, all of that. Notice how those are rules, commands, and if you break those rules, you do wrong. Insofar as you adhere to those rules, you do right. What we're going to study in this class is a form of deontology which was developed by Kant, and it kind of comes out of the Enlightenment. which is around the 17th century. The idea that we're kind of autonomous, independent, rational persons who can think for ourselves. It's the idea that we kind of give the rational law to ourselves and we should adhere to that law. Right? It's similar to this kind of divine command theory where God is commanding us, but the difference is that it's our own reason that's giving us these laws and not so much kind of a divine being that's outside of ourselves. So a third theory which we will study is utilitarianism. It's the view that morality, or the morality of an action, depends upon the extent to which it maximizes the happiness for all. Just as a side note here, utilitarianism and hedonism are both, and hedonism is the view that, well, morality is based upon pleasure and pain. We'll kind of look at that in other areas. So it's a version of consequentialism, which is the idea that, well, what's morally right and wrong just depends upon the consequences. You could say, well, is what he or she did, are their motives good? And you could say, it doesn't matter. What matters is the consequences, is what they did and what they do lead to good events, etc. Okay, so utilitarianism is kind of like that, and it's based upon this, what's called this happiness principle, which is let's maximize happiness for all. And we'll study that through the works of John Stuart Mill. The final one which we'll study is relativism. And it's kind of a theory which sort of floats around in our society today. Usually relativism and utilitarianism are the two basic views in our democratic societies, kind of because it just goes along with how we are, where we all have to kind of live equally happily together to the extent that's possible. So relativism then is the view that moral values are basically human creations. So I could say, well, what's right and wrong is what you believe is right and wrong, and you could say, well, that person is a moral egoist, because they think, well, right and wrong is just depends upon my individual view. Another view could say, well, right and wrong depends upon different cultures. Look at the Mayans. They had different moral views. Look at the ancient Greeks, and look at another society. They all had different views. You can't say they were wrong, right? They just had different moral views. That's called cultural relativism. And basically it's the idea that there's no objective, universal, or real moral values out there. They're just kind of dependent upon our societies. We're going to look at a very interesting version of a kind of cultural relativism, or you could call it kind of a historical relativism, which we're going to see in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. And we'll talk about that later as we get to his works toward the end of the class.